we've already talked about introductions and we talked about the front end of the paper, we got to talk about the butt end of the paper. So the next thing we need to talk about are conclusions and how to tackle them and what to do with them and why the heck we actually need them. So just like introductions, every single paper absolutely has to have a conclusion. If you don't have a conclusion, then you just leave your reader hanging. So think of it a couple different ways. So in the introduction video, we use the example of being in the pool. If you're still in that above ground pool and we take the ladder out of the pool and say get out, and you're short like me and can't lift yourself over the rail on the side of the pool, you're stuck. You need that ladder to ease you out of the pool, just like you needed the ladder to ease you in the pool. Another way to think about it is, do you ever watch TV with somebody? My husband does this all the time and he drives me crazy, but I'm watching a show that I like and it'll go to commercial and he'll grab the remote and he'll change the channel to watch something because he can't sit through a 3-minute commercial. And he'll promise he'll go back to the show I was watching, and then he finds something else interesting and never goes back to the show, and I never find out what happened and see what happens. Do you know what I'm talking about? Or when you're sitting in the movies and you're watching a movie and it gets to the very end and the reel cuts off and the screen goes black and you don't know what happens. It's like the series finale of Sopranos or something like that. When you don't have a resolution to things, it leaves you with this really uneasy feeling. So when you don't have a way to tie up and end your paper, it leaves your reader wondering what the hell is missing. And the thing is that whether we realize it or not, we are so trained, we just automatically know that something should ease us in and something should ease us out. So a conclusion's job is to ease the reader out of the paper. If you are the type of person who likes to use the same word to define something, yes, a conclusion's job is to conclude. So it ties up the paper. And it gives it some finality. So what you do in a conclusion is you recap what happened. You reword your thesis. And you do something called future applications. If you do a narrative introduction, you can very easily do sort of a narrative conclusion as well. And in your narrative conclusion, you would show the growth or the progression. So if in the introduction, if I'm talking about how Kobe scares people, but he gets to work as a police dog every day, maybe in the conclusion I'm talking about how many arrests he's made or helped with, or what he does at the end of his day after he's done being a crime fighter during the day or something like that. But if you use that narrative style in the conclusion, like you did in the narrative, in the introduction, it's got to have some evolution. It's got to grow a little bit. But the main things that you want to do in the conclusion is not repeat, but recap or summarize the stuff that was in the paper. The next thing you want to do is reword the thesis. So do not copy and paste your thesis from the intro to the conclusion, but you want to say the thesis again, but in different words. So you're going to emphasize it, not repeat it. And this way it helps drive your point home of the point of the entire paper. And then you do something in your conclusion. Now, if you never do this last thing, it's no big deal. It could still be a good conclusion. but when you add this in here, it makes it a great conclusion. So future applications means what can be done in the future with this information, or what can be done in the future to change things. So if you're writing a paper on breast cancer, for instance, in your conclusion you can talk about how maybe finding a cure will help thousands of women and men across the country. That would be a future application, something that could happen in the future. You can do a normal pyramid to write a conclusion. So we were talking about the inverted pyramid in the introduction. You can do something like that for your conclusion and do it the opposite way. But that's kind of going to be difficult because your conclusion doesn't necessarily need to go from specific to broad. Just like your introduction has to go from broad to specific. Your conclusion doesn't have to do that. The best way to write a conclusion, in my opinion, and like I said, there are different techniques and strategies to everything, but this is the one that I have found that students like the most, and students have a tendency to benefit from the most. The first thing you need to do is print out whatever your paper is. The next thing you need to do is draw squares around paragraphs that talk about the same thing, if you need more than one paragraph to explain something. Then on the right-hand margin, you write one sentence that summarizes that particular paragraph or whatever that point was. One sentence, summary, that's it. After you've written those summaries for however many paragraphs you have, glue them together, just like we did in the introduction in the inverted pyramid. When you glue them together, they're going to look ugly and they're going to look gross, but there's your recap of the paper without repeating yourself. So that's kind of a quick way to write a conclusion if you struggle with it. Just like I gave you in the intro, and the thing with the conclusion is there really are no set ways to write it. So the introduction, I gave you two different strategies of doing the conclusion, or doing the introduction, sorry. The conclusion doesn't really have planned out methods like an introduction does. So that's why I was recommending drawing the squares around the paragraphs and summarizing, do a one-sentence summary for each, because that at least gives you some kind of structure and it gives you a game plan, like the inverted pyramid does for the introduction. Again, if you did a narrative introduction, you should really try and do a narrative conclusion, because it really it marries the whole paper together and it gives it some, it kind of ties it back together. It makes it cyclical. It makes it flow better. It seems like it was all planned out to happen that way. But again, if you're going to do that narrative information in your conclusion, the story should grow from the beginning of your paper to the end. And a lot of the times it can grow based on the information that you've presented. So if you're doing that paper on breast cancer, for instance, and in your narrative introduction, you do something like, Mary hasn't been feeling well for a while. She's been suffering from headaches, nausea, and I don't even know if these are the proper symptoms or not, but maybe you list a couple symptoms like that. One day while she was in the shower, she notices a lump on her breast and goes to the doctor for some tests to be done. She finds out that she has breast cancer. Breast cancer claims the lives of millions of men and women each year. That was my thesis statement. So maybe in my informative paper, because that was the kind of thesis statement I just did, now in the paper I'm going to talk about signs, symptoms, prevention, treatment, maybe how many people have lost their lives, how many people survive it, stuff like that. So now in my conclusion, I don't even remember what I called her, if it was Barb or Beth or none of the above. But now I can do something like, after all the chemotherapy and radiation has been done, Barb, I don't even remember what name I said, whatever her name, we'll call her Mary now. After all of the tests have been done and she is now in remission, she's more aware of signs that her body is giving her about the disease. Finding a cure for breast cancer will help her along with many others in the future. So I was able to kind of recap the paper because I talked about the treatments that you did in the paper earlier, like chemotherapy and radiation and all that kind of stuff. I reworded my thesis about the numbers of people dying, but I did it in a way to also tie in that future application a little bit. And what I just did is an example of what you should not do, which I actually had a student do before. She did the narrative intro and she did the narrative conclusion, and it worked really well, but the character had one name in the introduction and had a completely different name in the conclusion. So you have to make sure that those stay the same, and I totally was just an example of how not to do that because I forgot what name I used. But just like your introduction, I have a do not list for your conclusions as well. You are not allowed to forget a conclusion. Just like you need to have an introduction, just like you need to have a thesis statement, you absolutely need to have a conclusion. You are not allowed to leave one off. If you do, then your paper is not finished. Do not restate your thesis in the same exact words and call it a day. You have to reword it, not restate it. Remember, we said that putting things in the same exact words is repeating yourself, but saying the same idea in different words is emphasizing a point. So you want to emphasize your point and not repeat yourself. Some of these on the do not list are going to be similar or the same to the introduction. So you are not using citations, and you are not apologizing for the same reasons that you don't do it in the introduction. You're not allowed to use citations in the conclusion because the conclusion is just supposed to be a recap of everything that was in the paper already. So you are not presenting new information in your conclusion. If you have new information in your conclusion that is nowhere else in your paper, that paragraph cannot be your conclusion. And I will label it and I will say, this is new information, so this can't be your conclusion. So where is your conclusion? That's typically exactly what my comment bubble will read because I write it a lot. So you cannot do this. If you have new information that you forgot to include earlier, you need to go back and make a new body paragraph. At the same token, you cannot do something I like to call a rush job. A lot of the times when you're a beginning writer, they teach you to do a list in your thesis. This paper will talk about chairs, tables, and couches. Well, if you've talked about chairs and tables, and I don't like that kind of thesis, by the way, either, but if you've talked about chairs and tables, and you get to the conclusion, you're like, oh, phew, I'm done. I reached the page limit. I'm good. I don't have to do anything else. And then you're like, oh, crap. I was supposed to talk about couches. I forgot to talk about couches. You cannot jam couches into your conclusion. You cannot rush it in there. You can't jam it in there because now you're putting new information in your conclusion. So if you get to your conclusion and you realize that you have new information and you're trying to jam it in there, you need to go back and make another body paragraph. Or you need to change your thesis statement to show that you're not going to maybe talk about that kind of a thing. I'm just writing some of the repeats that have hashtag justification. Yes, this list is bigger than introductions. So these are some of the same ones that we had in the list for the introductions. So you're not using quotes because that would be new information and maybe you would have to cite it. You're not going to use definitions because you should be done defining things because it's the end of the paper. You don't want to dilly-dally, you don't want to ask questions, and you don't want to answer unasked questions. Here come some of my favorites. Do not, for the love of goodness sake, do not start your conclusion with "in conclusion." That's a training wheel that we need to take off. It was good to do in junior high, it was good to do in middle school, it is not good to do anymore. If this is your conclusion and I know you're concluding, why do you have to announce your intentions and let me know you're concluding by saying "in conclusion"? That's what I have to say. So if you still cling to this and you need to say "in conclusion," that's fine in your draft. The words "in conclusion" are a way in. When you're done with your conclusion, just delete those two words and then you're still left with the same good sentence you started with. So number 13 is don't be a fortune teller. I gotta finish this list over here. Sorry, I'm running out of board space, as you can see. But I mentioned that a really great conclusion is gonna have future applications in it. So what could potentially happen in the future? But the truth of the matter is that none of us are fortune tellers. So you cannot predict what will happen in the future. So I had a student doing a paper on Taylor Swift, for instance. And it was an informative paper about how many records she sold and how much success she's had and things like that. And in the conclusion, the student wrote that she will be successful and be around and be influential in the music industry for many years to come. Well, how does she know that? She's not her agent. She doesn't even know Taylor Swift. How does she know? Has she rubbed her crystal ball to find out that that's what will happen in the future? If you are not a fortune teller, then you can't make statements that make you sound like a fortune teller. Number 14, do not be Miss America, E. What the heck do I mean by that? This goes along with the future applications as well. So if you write something in your conclusion, let's say you're doing a paper on recycling, for instance, and in your conclusion you're talking about how great recycling is, and you do the sentence something like, the next bottle that you recycle can save the planet. Then you sound like Miss America, because what is every time Miss America wins, what does she say that she's going to do? Every time Miss America wins, they always say they're going to solve world peace. Yeah, okay. So all of the religious, political, military leaders have never been able to do this in thousands of years. But the size 0 beauty queen wearing a crown is going to be able to do it in 12 months after she's done riding on parade floats and opening all the grocery stores in town. No offense to any beauty queens, but don't ever let that be your answer at the end. It's too lofty, it's too dramatic, it's too not going to happen. So if you're writing a paper doing the aerosol can that you throw away will save the ozone layer, then you're Miss America E. You're sounding like Miss America. Don't be too flowery and over dramatic like that. Like, seriously? It could be true, but really, the one aerosol can that I throw away is going to save the ozone layer, not the 85,000 that the other people are using. Just this one? Nah, not quite. Number 15 is please do not use fluff. If you don't have anything left to say, then stop. You don't need to talk too much. Again, in this case, less can be more. A longer conclusion does not mean that you have a better conclusion. So if you're out of things to say, if you've already recapped and you can't think of anything else, if you've already reworded your thesis, if you've already done all of that, and you've already done your future applications, and that's about it, then stop. You don't have to keep going and BS your way through it. It's fine. No fluff. It's a lot of the times in the conclusion that people end up using colloquialisms. Usually in a conclusion, you've run out of stuff to say. You don't quite know where you're going with things. So that's when you throw in the grass is greener on the other side kind of things. Because it feels like you need something to say, but you don't quite know what it is. So you throw in one of these colloquialisms or sayings. Don't use them. For the same reason we talked about in the slang and jargon video, it just shows that you can't find what you want to talk about next. So let's say I had no idea what was coming next in this lecture, and I just started telling random stories, or I kind of just stood here staring at the board, and I read each one of these points off back to you again, because I couldn't think of where I was going. Wouldn't you, to an extent, start to see right through that? Wouldn't you be sitting there going, okay, I'm not ready. Come on, I can read for myself. You don't have to read it back to me. I get it. I got it. I'm good. Right? Wouldn't you maybe start to see right through it? Now, in some of these videos, I write something and then I forget and then I go back and things like that. But I'm obviously not using notes. I don't have anything in front of me. I don't have a piece of paper in front of me. If I had to keep checking stuff all the time, if I was holding a piece of paper while I was writing this stuff on the board, would it look like I didn't know what I was talking about, or would it look like I didn't really know where I was going next? When you do these things, it's a writing version of holding that piece of paper while I'm writing on the board. It's kind of a way where your reader can see right through you, just like you guys as students might see right through me. And that doesn't mean at points that I don't forget things, or that doesn't mean at points maybe I need to glance at something to jog my memory so I remember where I'm going. But there's a big difference between needing some help and needing a crutch. So you guys don't need crutches in your writing. Again, if you need to start your conclusion with in conclusion for now, do that. But before you turn in a final draft, delete the words in conclusion, and then you'll be left with the good stuff that was there. So just like with the introductions, I want you to pause the video so that this way all of this information will stay up on the screen for you. And I want you guys, if you're in the classroom, to talk about the things that you are guilty of doing at some point in time, or maybe currently. If you're at home and you're watching this at home alone without any other students with you, I want you to make your list and go, oh, yep, I do that. Yep, I've done them. Yep, do that all the time. I have totally never put my thesis statement in there at all. So I want you to go through that stuff, because hopefully this do not list will help you, just like the do not list in the introductions, to be kind of used as a checklist to make sure you're not doing any of these things before you turn in a final paper. And the thing to remember is that nobody sees your drafts. Yeah, I might, and yeah, your classmates might see drafts of what you're writing. But the thing is that nobody knows what process you go through except you. So I could ask all of you guys to leave here right now and drive to Philadelphia. Each one of you might take a different route because there are a bunch of ways to get there. But as long as you end up in the same place at the end of the day, that's all that matters. So if you need to do a lot of brainstorming, if you need to do that inverted pyramid thing where you have to make lists and write sentences and then glue them together and go through all of those steps, yeah, that's a lot on you, but that's nothing to be embarrassed about or to feel weird about, because all you're doing is making yourself better. So if you go through all those steps and nobody else does, who's ever going to know that you had to go through all of those steps? Only you. So the final product looks a lot different than what you have to go through to get there. So please don't think that I am expecting any of you to be able to sit down and crank out a final draft, because I am not at all, and that's not what should be happening. So a lot of the times you're going to need these checklists next to you as you're writing conclusions and you're writing introductions and things like that. So there are handouts. If you are in the classroom and there's a substitute with you, there are handouts for you on introductions and on conclusions. There are handouts for you on transitions and on sentence structure. I didn't do videos on transitions and sentence structure because when I'm typically in the classroom with you guys, I only lecture on those things based on if the class really needs it or not. And since you guys are in the beginning part of the mod, we could always add that in later if we need to. But just remember, this whole thing is a process. And as long as you try and get better every single time you do it, you'll be fine. So go over this list and see what you're guilty of doing and maybe what you can do to not do it anymore.